Hello.
Back to Without the Beatles. Except it's not without the Beatles today, it's without Brian Wilson.
Yeah, very sad.
That's a sad thing to have to say, isn't it?
Yeah, I freaked you out. We were recording one of the previous shows. I was talking about his wife passing, and I accidentally said he died, and that freaked you out. And then now it's actually happened, so I feel a bit like I jinxed it.
It's going to happen eventually.
Yeah.
No, it is sad. I mean, obviously, when someone dies and they're 82 and they've been ill, it's that bittersweet thing of, they're probably better off in a way. But I think the thing about Brian, as with the Beatles, is that they represent a little bit more than just a celebrity whose music you like. And I think that's true it's very clear on social media, isn't it? That that's the case for many, many, many.
Yeah, I think people have associate so much of their lives with his music and him. And I think the fact that he survived for so long, he was, kind of probably on the cards to be the one who went first, and he outlived all his brothers, and you know, it's yeah, it's not, like you say, it's not unexpected, but it still feels like a shock. It feels like a kind of a cultural shock, I suppose, as well.
We say later on in today's program when we're talking to our guest, there's a sense in which we're being slowly orphaned culturally.
Yeah,
because the people we love most are now all in their 80s or 90s.
Yeah, and I think it's also a moment. And obviously, he was recording before I was born, and same with the Beatles. But it feels like music kind of crossed a lot more boundaries and kind of was more embedded in cultural society, I think, at that time. And I think these days it's hard to think of a figure today who would affect us in such the same way. I mean, obviously, I love modern music, and I'm always trying to keep abreast of new stuff. But I don't feel as attached to the people as much as I used to the composers or the writers.
So the big argument would be there, you old fogey, right?
Exactly.
It's not true because but in both our cases, being huge Beatle fans, we miss the Beatles. So they weren't our contemporaries. My contemporaries, the people that I should have been the music you're growing up with, we should have been Duran Duran and things like that. And at the time, I mean, I've got nothing against them now, but at the time, I very tribally hated all of those. I thought the only piece of music came out of the 60s, which I discovered myself. And so in a way that it's what you grew up with doesn't really apply because the Beatles were not in my ear all day, every day, unless I put them there.
I guess probably like Bowie, and to an extent, I mean, George Michael I really grew up with, and really kind of, that was kind of my era. And I was very moved and touched when he died. And I think Bowie was the last one that really felt like a massive cultural thing, and he was still around. And I think similar to Brian, he was having a bit of a reawakening in a sense. He sort of, Bowie's in a very different reasons, but he sort of publicly said he wasn't interested in music anymore, and he was going to concentrate on growing up bringing his daughter up. And then he suddenly sort of got his mojo back. And I think Brian, through a lot of encouragement from others, but there was still an output there. And it kind of feels like, sometimes when people pass away, you think, well, they haven't done anything for 35 years. So, it's sad that they passed away, but you're not missing out on any of their art. But, you could argue how much Brian was actually contributing to the better of the later stuff. But I still think there was, he's a guy with a genius for melodies, and, you kind of want that person around to be doing whatever they can.
Brian, for me, is a bit like the Beatles, because you get the people who love the first 2 years. For me, there's a good argument for them being a sort of prototype boy band. I don't really join in until the first darker songs start turning up. I mean, I do love the early stuff, but I don't listen to anything. I come in with, Babies in Black or something on Be Your Sale.
Yeah, or I'm a Loser and No Reply, and they're sort of kind of slightly dark. You say sort of, it's sort of taking that pop songwriting to a new place, isn't it? Which I think is exactly what Brian did it. I think probably the reason it affects us so much is that I think you could probably argue he's the one who made people, the wider society, if you like, take pop music seriously. I think just before the Beatles, because the Beatles were, kind of vying with him famously, but I think he probably, the fact that he wrote these kind of orchestral arrangements then made Paul McCartney especially think, oh, we can do this, and we can treat it like classical music, and maybe like our parents' generation will take it seriously now. And I think there was like a penny drop moment for him when he heard particularly Pet Sounds, obviously.
For me, it's that division between, just before Pet Sounds through to the end of the 60s. I still count, and early 70s, I still count Surf's Up, the album, as even though he's not really there, his writing is all over it. And in fact, Surf's Up is my favorite Beach Boys song.
Yeah. I picked that up for 49p in Caterpillar Records in Taunton in about 1988, I think, 87, 88. I remember just thinking, oh, it was at that time when people weren't really talking, thought it can't be that bad. And it's got Surf's Up on it, which I already knew was like an incredible song. I remember just saying to my friends, "This like, how come no one talks about this album? It's incredible, it is." And even the Disney Girls and stuff like that, the kind of ones which are, there's a few other songs which are kind of the rest of the band are involved in. I still think really stand up as good as anything else they did.
Till I Die's on there as well.
Yeah.
If you've got an album with Till I Die and Surf's Up on it, you've got one of the greatest albums of all time, as far as I'm concerned. But
yeah, actually, I was looking, obviously, when we're going to do this, and when I heard the news, I was looking through the actual vinyl records I've got, and the only Beach Boys vinyl I've got is Surf's Up, and then Brian Wilson's first solo album. And I still listen to them a lot. I was actually listening when because he passed away, but it wasn't like I had to dig it out of the bottom of the pile. I had the record next to my record player because I've been listening to it a few weeks before.
It's really interesting. Do you remember Steve Van Zandt said in the interview we did in season 1? It's really interesting, isn't it? Because Terry Gilliam said, both bands started with BEA and then go in different directions.
yeah, that's true. Yeah,
but actually, in the end, I think they went to the same place, more or less. Which is a place of experimentation. It's a place of poetry. It's a place of introspection. It's a place of harmony, melodicism, experimentalism is all that, I mean, the Beach Boys never did, thank God, Helter Skelter, but otherwise they're peers, they're absolute peers, and
yeah, absolutely, yeah. And I love that fact that them kind of egging each other on in a way, and listen to each other's output, certainly for a couple of years.
So we should introduce our guest. We 2 days ago we met up with did a call with James Warren, who is famous for being in Stackridge, the first band on at Glastonbury, of the first ever Glastonbury, and a great band who were produced by George Martin, as we'll discuss, and also his most famous being in the Korgis. Yeah,
right.
Everybody's got to learn.
Yeah, sometimes. And If I Had You as well, which is an amazing song too.
That is a good song too.
He didn't write it, to be fair, but he was on it.
Well, he's a huge Brian fan, so we thought we'd catch up with him to see what he thought, and then we'll come back afterwards. So here we are, James Warren. So we'd like to welcome James Warren from Stackridge and the Korgis. How are you, James? Are you all right?
I'm very well, thanks. Yeah.
Hi, James.
Yeah, hi there.
We've gathered today together to celebrate, the genius that is Brian Wilson. And Stackridge and the Korgis have often been associated with the Beatles for various reasons, working with George Martin and Andy working with John Lennon and things like that, and the songs you've written. But I suspect going back, the Beach Boys and Brian Wilson, if you just listen to your work, had just as big an impact on you.
Oh, I think so. Yeah, I absolutely adored the melodies that Brian came up with and the harmonies. I loved especially Pet Sounds, of course. I loved the Smile stuff as well, including Smiley Smile. And I love some of the songs on the Surf's Up album. That's my favorite sort of period. But generally, how could one not love what Brian came up with?
One of the things I was going to say to you is about Smiley Smile, because I love some of that early Stackridge stuff, like Friendliness. Friendliness sounds like it could have come straight from Smiley Smile.
Yeah, I'm afraid you caught me out there. Definitely influenced by Smiley Smile. Yeah.
Was it Wild Honey as well? I remember it when I first discovered that there was a double CD with both of them on it. It obviously had lots of
That's right.
Smile outtakes in it, which is it's great.
Yeah.
when you're a writer and they say, you know, so and so influenced me. I mean, how direct is that influence? I mean, you know, can you picture yourself back as a teenager? What was going on in James's life, and what part did these records play?
Well, I couldn't play piano. I was a guitarist, but I started living in a flat which had a nice old upright piano. So I was always plonking around on it, trying to make some headway as a piano player. And the kind of chord sequences that Brian tended to use, especially having sort of different bass notes with the chord that you wouldn't expect, that was definitely an influence on my writing.
And you play bass as well, right? So
I play bass guitar, yeah, and sort of rhythm guitar, yeah, and very, very basic piano. I mean, I wrote Everybody's Got to Learn Sometime on the piano, but I've got no technique as such.
however, Everybody's Got to Learn Sometime, for example, that's got something in common for me with God Only Knows, because people don't use diminished chords anymore, but there's God Only Knows does two diminished chords, you know, as it goes through that verse, and there's that beautiful moment in Everybody's Got to Learn Sometime where you do that. So I mean, it's really interesting. They're just out of fashion, aren't they? No one uses them.
They are, yeah. I mean, George Harrison was the biggest advocate of using diminished chords in songs, wasn't he? All his songs later on, after the Beatles, tended to have diminished chords cropping up. Yeah, they're underrated, but they're lovely.
There's this thing, if you're a guitarist, well, you are a bit of a guitarist, right? When you discover diminished chords for the first time and you play the four finger one at the top there, and then you slide it up 4 frets, same chord, up another four chords. So
it's magical, isn't it?
There isn't a guitarist in the world who hasn't written a song that goes, you know, which is Ghost Town by the Specials do that as well, you know.
Yeah, that's right.
I was going to say also about it's interesting songwriters who play the bass. You know, obviously, you know, there's obvious parallels with Paul McCartney and Brian. But I was watching film Carol Kay the other day, and she was saying when she came into sessions, she said the thing she noticed most is like, wow, I'm actually going to play some melody on this. So it's, you know, it's not just the usual, you know, sort of, it's like pinning the song. And I think that comes across a lot. And even like God Only Knows, she sort of played a little bit where, you know, songs where the bass isn't so much to the fore, you still kind of notice that, you know, there's a way that he's written it with the bass and then added on top of that.
That's right.
How was what about the rest of Stackridge back then? Did that fit in with their influences too, or was it more, you know, diverse than that?
I think it was essentially me and Andy Davis that were really keen on Brian Wilson and the Beatles. Yeah, and Andy has got a lovely touch, and he's a lovely pianist. And some of the stuff he came up with, I think, was definitely influenced by Brian Wilson and Paul McCartney.
Would you say your approach to recording and composing as well was quite influenced? Because obviously, I think Brian was instrumental in, you know, treating it like a symphony and recording in parts and putting it together. Which
that's right. Oh, definitely. Yeah, having different segments and sort of sticking them together to make a song. I mean, you mentioned that song Friendliness on that early Stackridge album, and that was just like a fragment I had, and I always meant to have a lot more segments attached to it, but I didn't get around to it, so we just used a little fragment that you hear on the album. I was intrigued by that whole sort of modular approach that Brian had, and I wanted to try and, you know, do more of that kind of thing.
Of course, it drove him mad, which is an interesting thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I think he took it, you know, because it was such a success for Good Vibrations. I think that's essentially the story.
Yeah.
I'll do a whole album like it, you know, and it turned up just as he was starting to do the heavy psychedelics, you know. So
yeah, I was just reading another article recently about Good Vibrations and Heroes and Villains. I think it was the guy Alex Petridis who writes in The Guardian, really good writer, and he said that Heroes and Villains, you know, just took it one step a bit too far. You know, it just sounded like, you know, different little things which had very, very sort of artificially been stitched together, whereas Good Vibrations had a lovely flow to it, even though it was modular. And I mean, I love Heroes and Villains as well, I have to say. You know, it's a great track.
Yeah, I think that's true, actually. If you look at the single version and compared to the Smart version, it does feel a bit like, you know, there are obvious joins, aren't there? Whereas I think Alexis, in the same article, he said about, it's quite clever, Good Vibrations, he covered up the joins by...
That's right. Reverb.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. That's really cool. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Have you listened to, I just dug it out last week because I hadn't really listened to it. I went to see the Smile concerts when Brian did those.
Yeah,
they were brilliant, weren't they? I went 3 times. I was so excited. But
Mm.
about 5 years ago, they released the Smile Sessions as a mono album. And what's interesting about that is it's in the same order as that Brian Wilson Smile. So they've put it together as if
Yes.
it sounds
Yes.
very similar. But what's really
Yeah.
interesting there is they haven't cut hard on heroes and villains. So as each section ends, the reverb trails out and it's finished, right?
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
can really hear this mania even more clearly there because it's not joined together, right?
Yeah.
So here's
Yeah.
a whole chunk of madness. Here's another chunk of madness. Here's some
Yeah.
weird narrative that doesn't make any sense. I mean, the idea that there's any narrative in it is hilarious, isn't it? Because it's just some kind of random snapshots
Yeah.
about some kind of fantasy Americana,
Yeah.
but that's all it is.
Yeah.
But somehow still beyond beautiful. I love Smile so much.
Oh, me too. But do you know, I was so disappointed that there's only a mono version of those Smile Sessions. If only they've done a stereo. I'm a big stereo freak. I love stereo. So I wish they'd done a stereo version of it. I actually have an album by on the Purple Chick label. I don't know if you know that label, indie sort of label, and they've done a stereo version of all these Smiles sort of outtakes and things, and that's really good.
I think that's a bootleg, actually, is what that is.
Yeah,
There's-
probably.
The Beatles have got versions of those on the same label, you know.
Right. Yeah. Ah, right. Yeah, they haven't they? Yes, you're right.
I had a
Yeah.
mad experience, James, once. Absolutely fantastic. It was one of those, at the BBC, I was doing a series about classic songs, and I had to do a month in America, and I interviewed all the most. I mean, it was insane. Like 3 people a day. Nancy Sinatra first thing, Jeff Lynne,
Wow.
Jeff Lynne in the afternoon, Fleetwood Mac in the evening for a month. Right, it was crazy.
Wow.
One of the people I interviewed was Barry Mann and Cynthia Weil, and we were talking about You've Lost That Loving Feeling, and once we had a few beers and things and were warmed up, Cynthia says, "You know something? I want to play Des the stereo backing track of You've Lost That Loving Feeling." And even at that stage, Barry was going, "We can't. Phil will go mad if anyone hears this. He'll go mad. He'll be, no, we can't." And in the end, she goes, "Oh, to hell with him. Come on, let's go down the studio." And so we sat in the studio, and on the big speakers, they played this beautiful stereo backing track. And actually, despite what Phil says, it sounds much better.
Yeah, I bet.
I was really I was really knocked out because it was just a master, it was a digital master of that they'd had all these years, and it sounded amazing. Same trip, actually, I interviewed Mike Love, Hal Blaine, Carol Kay, and Brian.
Blimey. That's
That was-
incredible.
Yeah, that was incredible. So Carol
And
gave me a bass lesson on how to play Good Vibrations, so
yeah.
she wrote that. She wrote that, not Brian.
I suspected that she would have come up with that. Yeah.
She's an interesting character, I've got to say.
And how was Mike Love in the flesh to talk to?
It's a funny story. He had everyone we were doing were in LA, and he was the only one. He was in Vegas, and he said, "Come here for 12 o'clock." But we had one in the evening. It's a 4-hour drive, 5-hour drive. So we got up dawn, we're pre-dawn, got there just in time, set up, and he was late. He was doing the Beach Boys show, and I said,
Right.
"We've got to go. I mean, I want to do it, but we've got to go." So I spoke to his PA and said, "We're going," and he come in a couple of minutes later with a napkin still on, wiping his mouth and going, I'm eating, but come on, if you're doing it, let's do it. And I said, "Well, we've got to be back. We're meeting Nancy Sinatra later." He goes, "Couldn't Miss Sinatra wait?" And I went, "Why should she?" He was actually quite charming. He was charming.
I was going to say he was quite gracious in that, wasn't he? Yeah, I was quite surprised. It was
Oh, right.
Yeah, wasn't what I was expecting, and it's very.
I mean, I've seen TV interviews with him since Brian's death, and I agree, he comes across very, very charming and gracious. Yeah. Yeah.
James, you're in a band. James, you've been in several bands. At the point where disagreements come in, if someone was reporting it from outside, it looks terrible, but it probably it doesn't actually affect too much interpersonal relationships, does it?
Yeah, I guess that's right. Yeah. I mean, I just happened to see a clip of Neil Young talking about the relationships in Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. And he seemed, he was saying that, it's all overblown, all this stuff about, we drove each other mad, and began to hate each other. That then they were my brothers. I love them. I still love Steve Stills, to this day, we're brothers. And, so, yeah, you're right. From the outside, it's quite different to the guys on the inside often.
I think Mike Love did, put up a lot of barriers to, pet sounds and things like that.
Yeah.
And he plays it now, though.
Yeah, yeah. Did you read that book he put out a few years back? Oh, yeah, I got it. Yeah, yeah.
Why did he say?
Well, he sort of covers his tracks very skillfully. That I never hated Pet Sounds. That's completely wrong. I'm just blah 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 blah. Yeah, just sort of smoothing all over. Yeah,
Yeah, he's got a bit of a take that it was he just wanted to have hits and he liked it as a musically, but he thought they should, he kind of I think tempered
yes,
it a bit, hasn't he? Yeah. Is it Chris Thomas who produced Nevermind the Bollocks and the White Album? He sort of put the White Album together when everyone else
he
dropped
did. I know him from the White Album stuff. Yeah,
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 because I interviewed him, and he was interesting because I said, "What was that like the sessions?" Because it seemed so disjointed, and everyone,
yeah,
and it was like, all this stuff about musical differences. Everyone was lovely, it was totally fine. It's like what happened privately. Maybe they were falling out, but they come in the studio, they're really professional. If someone
yeah,
did up, they'd be fine because, like, well, he's not on that track because there isn't a piano, or whatever it was. Said there was no problem, no hint of any sort of thing. It's like
yeah,
everyone was lovely, got on really well, and then you hear all this stuff later about, oh, they were falling apart. That's why the album sounds like that. And it's,
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
I mean, it may have been more like, the recent Get Back film, where there was a lot of great sort of love and camaraderie going on, and just like isolated sort of pockets of upset and disagreement. Maybe the White Album sessions were more like that.
The original, the original film of that, because they've just re-released that and cleaned it up, haven't they? And it's terrible compared to the whole Get Back session. It's really got
Yeah, I'm
awful
sure.
mood. And they cut it even when there's moments of like relief, and they all get back together and they all say sorry to each other. And all that's cut out, so you just feels like they're on each other's back the whole time.
Oh,
And when Billy Preston turns up, it's such an amazing moment when you see him and everybody relaxes and they all say, "We love you, Billy," and stuff. And none of that's in. It's just like one minute he's just playing keyboards in the background of one of the tracks. Nobody even mentions he's there.
Back in the day, Stackridge, of course, had. I think most people critically say "The Man in the Bowler Hat" is, the most complete Stackridge album. It's how I got into Stackridge. I think that album sounds like it was recorded yesterday. It's incredible sonics, right?
You think? Oh, well, great.
And it was produced by George Martin. So you're in a unique position to say how big an influence do you think George? How big is George's influence on the Beatles? Because you've seen what he can do for a band.
I know where you're coming from with that question, but funnily enough, our experience, I think, maybe was rather different to how the Beatles would have experienced George, in as much as he was at that period, 1973, he was beginning to sort of branch out and recording all sorts of wildly different sort of albums, Mahavishnu Orchestra, Jeff Beck, and Stackridge and other weird and wonderful stuff. And basically, he was an incredibly busy man, and he had like sort of 10 days or 14 days were allotted to Stackridge. But mainly we worked with with Jeff Emerick and Bill Price. We did a couple of days at George's house in Paddington where we went over the various songs, and he said, "Yeah, I can see that one. I can do stuff with that song. Maybe not that song, though. So we sort of selected which songs to record." And then he wrote the various arrangements. But then basically he was off much of the time, going to New York for meetings, going to LA to meetings. And we just carried on working with Jeff Emerick, Bill Price. So we didn't get the full kind of George Martin experience, really, which I'm sure the Beatles would have had.
You did get the full Jeff Emerick experience, though.
Yeah, it's pretty.
Yeah, that was great. Yeah. And Bill Price was really great as well. Yeah, great engineers. And it was wonderful. It was the original Air London Studios in Oxford Street, above the, whatever it was, opposite the tube station. Yeah, everything just sounded great. I mean, when you heard playback, you just thought, oh, wow, this is where it's at, definitely.
And was he good at with the time you did have with him? Was he a good interpreter of musical ideas? I mean, did you get something from it?
Oh yes, definitely. And I love his arranging. The arrangements were just fantastic on Bowler Hat, especially Galloping Gaucho and Humiliation, the string quartet stuff going on. Yeah, it was just fabulous.
I always thought it's Galloping Gaucho, isn't it, with the organ, which it was a bit Mr. Kite-ish,
That's right. Yeah, the middle sections of the Galloping Gaucho. Yeah, it is, isn't it? Yeah, reminiscent of Mr. Kite. Yeah.
One of your songs on there, which I absolutely adore, I think we discussed before, Humiliation. with the oboe, the big one, bassoon.
Bassoon, yeah.
Yes, and that arrangement, I was sitting there thinking, in the early 70s, by then, thanks to the Beatles, thanks to Brian Wilson, thanks to Pet Sounds, I mean, it would be perfectly acceptable to do all of that.
Yes.
Someone who lived through that from the point where it would have been just the Shadows and Chang 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 to Humiliation 10 years later, where you've got bassoons and things. Is that people talk about this, but was it a real transition? What was it like to live through that? And how did you develop as a songwriter arranger because of it?
For me, it was really exciting. I was never a sort of like pure rock and roll animal who just wanted to sort of play in a band, loud bass, loud guitars, and that sort of stuff. I was much more into the musicality, which came from 1966 onwards. I loved everything that the piano and organ and everything could contribute to pop, and then of course classical instruments as well. Yeah, I love the whole sort of thing of, oh yeah, let's have some clarinets on this, or let's have a bassoon, or a brass section. Yeah, I was all for it. So for me, it was a great development.
That's quite nice that quite often it's the guitarist who wants to be the rock and roll.
Yeah, I think secretly I was a kind of frustrated wannabe pianist. I mean, Andy's mother was a piano teacher, so Andy always had keyboards in his house right from the outset, whereas I never had that. But I loved. I mean, well, I used to love piano jazz more than guitar jazz, for example.
Yeah.
Strangely, perhaps.
Me too. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm a sort of piano person in secret. Yeah.
What was it like to be in a band where one of the members gets, one of your friends gets siphoned off to go and work on a John Lennon project? I mean, can you ever recover from the jealousy of that?
Yeah, it was unreal, an absolute dream. I mean, was that before the bowler hat? It would have been.
Must have been 71.
71, of course. Yeah, at that time. We were still living in Bristol, and we used to stay in a flat in Bayswater. Every time we came up to do gigs in London or in the home counties, we stayed in this flat in Bayswater, in which lived two girls who lived there all the time. They had like regular jobs, but they had some spare rooms, and we just sort of stayed there. And I just remember that occasion when Andy had been invited by this chap we knew at our agency, a chap called Rod Linton, who was in with the sort of John Lennon circle. And it was he who suggested to John Lennon's people, well, if you need some extra sort of rhythm guitar players, I know a good player, this guy, Andy Davis, he'll come and do it. And so it was Rod who introduced Andy to that whole thing. And I mean, I didn't mind. I mean, Andy's a great guitarist, so I mean, I can understand why he'd be the first choice rather than me. I mean, like a rhythm player, really. So that was, and then Andy came back one night, having been, John Lennon's house, playing on these songs, and it was just, oh, are we dreaming? Was I jealous? I'm not sure. I don't know. I mean, certainly I didn't. It wasn't like that sort of feeling at all. I was just sort of in wonderment, that Andy had been working with John Lennon. Yeah.
Isn't it Groucho Marx who said, every time a friend does well, you die a little?
Yeah. There is some truth in that, I suppose. Yeah.
A tiny little bit. Anyway, it's healthy competition. But I'm jealous of him, so I don't see why you shouldn't have.
Yeah.
Did you talk much about it? Did he say what the experience was like?
Oh yeah. He went into the details. Yeah. What did he play on? Oh, Yoko, and I think there's another one he played on as well. Give Me Some Truth or something. Yeah, but certainly Oh Yoko, I remember. Yeah. Along with the Badfinger guys, it was a team of them.
Give Me Some Truth is a really interesting one because that comes up in the Get Back film, and it's blatantly clear that Paul's writing it with him, and that doesn't come out until the Get Back documentary. It's basically co-write that he's chucking in as many lines as John is.
That's why I've always been skeptical, and I've read quotes from John Lennon saying, yeah, it was mostly me that wrote such and such a song, whereas obviously it sounds to me, no, that's definitely Paul. Surely he's coming up with those ideas, and Paul was capable of coming up with some very good lyrical ideas as well.
I interviewed Macca once. So I mentioned the Toronto Peace Concert and that John threw up on the side of the stage, nerves. And Paul goes, oh, nerves, that was heroin. I suspect a lot of what John said around that time was just, you can see in Get Back, they've actually got quite a good relationship, really. And It's
deep
just business
down.
crap, isn't it? It's usual business crap.
Glastonbury, we're coming into Glastonbury week soon, aren't we? You played the first Glastonbury, didn't you, in Stackridge?
I know, yeah.
That's pretty.
Outrageous, isn't it? But it wasn't called the Glastonbury Festival, of course, the first time round. It was called something like the Shepton Mallet Rhythm and Blues Festival.
Right, okay.
And there were about 200 people there and a few dogs walking around. And yeah, we were the first act on. Someone told me, because I got a shocking memory for the old days, but someone told me that, yeah, you guys actually finished the festival as well. At the end, they asked you to come back on and do a couple of things. I don't remember that, but maybe that was right, yeah. I think
David Bowie was that?
Mark Bolan and the Kinks were meant to be appearing. Whether they
Right.
I'm not sure they did in the end, but
Is that the one that David Bowie was at? Was he the?
Yeah.
I don't remember. Was it?
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Because he was definitely. They always said the first Glastonbury. I don't know if that was when it became Glastonbury Fair or.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, the other thing, let's talk about this. Brian's other influence, I think, is by popularizing the Beach Boys. He made Southern California a thing.
Yeah, he did.
And Southern California is as big a cultural influence as the Beatles.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's been amazing, isn't it? Yeah, he certainly did that. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that before now. That was a tremendous influence, I think, on the way pop developed.
Yeah.
So let's put it this way, Mark and James, I put it to you as a thought experiment. I can transport you back to any era in time and location. Are you going to go to Liverpool in 1963 or Sunset Strip in 1962? Which would you prefer and why?
Well, I would go for Liverpool, but if only it had the climate of Southern California.
I think Sunset Strip would be, probably more fun, but I think sort of culturally and to experience it, I think also Liverpool. I think I'd say too.
But that's only one half of my thought experiment. So I'll give you the same option. I'll give you the same option, and I give you London in 68 or Southern California in 68.
Ooh. Well, yeah. In that case, I might consider California, I think, 68. Yeah. I'm fascinated actually by Fleetwood Mac before Nix and Buckingham joined. They all that strange period when they were making all these albums and living and gigging in California and not quite sure, how to sort of develop. I find that quite a fascinating period, and the players that came and went, for one album and then disappeared, interesting for me.
I've listened to Bare Trees a lot recently. It's amazing.
Oh yeah.
So fantastic. It's hard playing on that. When you think that's the kind of the between stages before they.
Yes.
Very sort of beautiful, uplifting the title track and a few others. Really, really amazing.
Yeah. And how tragic the whole Danny Kirwan thing, isn't it?
I think there's a compilation album they've just brought out of his era. It's called the sort of the Danny Kirwan years or something.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's quite interesting to, there actually seems to be, consciously trying to shed the light on him a bit more.
Oh, good.
My job on this podcast, James, is to name drop all over the place simply because I have done interview people. But on that trip we were talking about earlier, I was interviewing Steve Miller.
Right.
He lives in Washington, but he said, "Well, I'm in LA while you're there. Come to the studio." So we went to Gold Star, not Gold Star, Western Recorders. When I got there, it's a tiny little studio. What he hadn't told me was he was playing Peter Green's parts in a reconstituted early Fleetwood Mac experiment. So we turned up. We're in this tiny studio. There's John, there's Mick, there's John Mayall, and they had a couple of other people. I don't know. They were filling in the other bits, and Pete and Steve was playing Peter's parts. And it was all very loose and everything. Everyone had a fag. We all sat and had a beer, and it was like, "Oh, come and sit on the floor while we were rehearsing." So I sat on the floor while they were doing, trying to get Albatross together and for the world and things like that. It was incredible.
Amazing.
An incredible experience. And when we got outside, I told Mick Fleetwood that my stepdad was a huge fan and was a drummer. And he said, "Well, Fleetwood Mac are finished." He goes, "I've got the road cases out here. Just take some bits from there and take them home." So I had to lug a bass drum skin and some crap all the way back to England.
What year was this?
2000.
2000.
2000. And do you know what John May was playing? Not a bloody guitar. He had a something like a DX7. It wasn't even like a contemporary synthesizer. It was some rubbish one from the 80s, really
Oh
thin.
my God.
And he had a ponytail and a Hawaiian shirt on. It was like, this is so wrong. I need to meet you in London in 68.
Brilliant.
It's an interesting thing. Last question. In Brian reps, he's 82. I mean, and not been in best of health. But there is some that we're all about to be orphaned. We're being orphaned one person at a time at the moment. Culturally, those of us who grew up and love that period, it's actually a period I wasn't expecting to feel so sad about. But I can see a lot of stories coming to an end within 10 years, and it's actually quite heartbreaking, actually.
Yeah, such a huge influence for any of those who were trying to make music from the sort of mid-60s onwards. Yeah, incomparable.
I'm getting older myself, but I don't like to contemplate the idea of, there being no Paul or Ringo in the world or
I
Brian.
know, that would seem impossible, wouldn't it? Yeah. But we managed it with John and George going, so I suppose we will.
It's really interesting because it's so often the case. I think that probably you and I and Mark here know as much about the Beatles as the Beatles know about the Beatles.
Probably.
That's weird, isn't it?
Yeah. Maybe even a little more in some instances. Yeah.
He said that quite often with Paul McCartney interview, doesn't he? So I've got people who tell me where I was and what I did at whatever.
Yeah.
It doesn't. I don't waste my brain space with that.
Well, you can't, can you? I mean, imagine if someone asked you to give a comprehensive account of your college years now.
Exactly. Yeah.
As you just said, James, you can't even remember yourself. So
I know. It's shocking. Yeah.
Imagine being at the first Glastonbury and not having a memory of it. Unfortunately, we need to wrap up, but we're back to Brian Wilson, I think.
Yeah.
What do you think his legacy will be, James?
Well, I suppose in terms of melody, I mean, incomparable, really, along with McCartney. They're the two fantastic melodists at top, aren't they? And yeah, I mean, maybe it's the falsetto bits, they included in so many songs. I mean, that's been some influence, I think, as well, in the way that pop singing is continued. I mean, it's just all-round musicality of Brian is just invaluable, isn't it?
Thanks so much, James, for joining us.
You're welcome.
We're going to do a proper full-length one at some point when you're in London.
Good one.
We can talk about all those other Beatle-related things.
Yeah,
songs you've written.
Yeah.
But we'll do that another time. It was great to have you on, and see you again soon, sometime.
Hope so. Yeah. Cheers. Thanks a lot.
Welcome back. So that was good.
Yeah.
You're not a big Stackridge fan, are you? Or you didn't know them?
You introduced me to them. I honestly didn't really know about them. So I'm glad you did, because couple of 3 or 4 months ago, I think it was actually, you messaged me. I was on a train, so luckily it was before I knew we were going to speak to James. So I'd went a bit of a deep dive, and you totally converted me. I was kind of somehow that passed me by, because it's right up my street and sort of ticks a lot of boxes for various other influences that I really like.
Strange enough, I think Stackridge sound a bit like if the Beatles and the Beach Boys worked together.
Exactly, yeah. And I think he's quite honest and open about that. You can see when he was saying, they're obviously both massive influences for him.
We should talk to him one day. We didn't bring it up in that interview, obviously, but because we were trying to talk about Brian and George Martin. But he wrote a song called "There's Something About the Beatles," so I'm pretty explicit about it.
Yeah, little clue there. Yeah.
But there is something about Brian as well, and I worked with him a couple of times. Did you?
You met? What was?
Did you get to interview him at all?
I didn't interview him, but I met him bizarrely. I'm trying to work out when there was some press conference in London. Yeah, you could well have been at it. It was off Regent Street somewhere. I'm trying to work out the timings wise. It was either when the Brian Presents Smile came out, or I think it might possibly have been the album before that, which was Getting Over My Head, which was the Andy Paley sessions when that some of the Andy Paley sessions when they finally came out. And the weird thing is, I can't really remember anything about why we were there. I think they showed a short film. There must have been something. I remember him sat on a stage. I can picture the stage, but I don't know where it was exactly. Little theatre type place. I can picture him sat there with somebody like a film director or a producer, but I wasn't really aware. And I think there was some press release sheet, and I was with my mate Simi, who's obsessed. Simi actually, amazing, used to be a member of the Beatles Boys. talking of another BEA band. I think he's one of the very few people who can say that. He drummed for them once when they were like a thrash metal band in New York. And anyway, I just remember I just texted him like, there's this random Brian Wilson press conference. They say he's going to be there. Let's go. So we went down. I didn't remember anything about what was said. And Brian wasn't, like sometimes he just wasn't really in the room. He wasn't really paying attention to anything. And the funny thing is, Simi was the one who connected with him, because in the conversation, it became quite apparent. It was at a stage when he wasn't talking to any of the other original Beach Boys, and he was just with his new band. And somebody quite early on said, let's move on. Brian doesn't want to talk about the Beach Boys. As it like talk about the music, fine, but not about the individual members. And then he just announced, this is why I'm thinking of the timing, because he just announced he was doing a new Christmas album called What I Really Want for Christmas. Awful album, but that was obviously the first Christmas album he'd done since the Beach Boys one. So that was quite a big thing. Christmas with the Beach Boys, it was called. And Simi just shouted out, sort of off the cuff, "Are you going to call it Christmas without the Beach Boys?" Because it's just being a bit cheeky, because they just said, he just wanted to have anything to do with the Beach Boys. And the only time Brian connected, he just suddenly stopped, and everyone you could see the director going, "Don't make jokes about that." And Brian just really suddenly turned around, looked at him, and ha 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 ha, and just sort of started giggling. But yeah, it definitely will be Christmas without the Beach Boys. But I like that. That was again, everyone sort of relaxed and sort of laughed. And then after that, they pretty much wound up the questions straight away. And then they said, I obviously hadn't read the full press release, which was sent to me on the email. And they said, okay, so now Brian's going to do his signing. So have you all got your albums? And everybody queued up, everybody in the whole room, which is all had their Pet Sounds albums. And me and Sue were like, what? I don't have it. And all I had was my iPhone. And you know what? I've got it here somewhere. I can't find it, really annoyingly. So I just gave him my iPhone, and he signed the back. Actually, it wasn't even an iPhone. It was an iPod, obviously, silver back, and had a marker pen. And he made a joke, and he was like, "Hey, I haven't signed a phone before." And everyone in the queue was sort of laughing, like, "Hey, this is a new one." He signed it, and I thought, what? Because it's obviously going to wipe off straight away. So I stuck some masking tape. It lasted about 10 years. And then I've sort of discovered it in a box, and it's completely smudged now. So, yeah. Amazing. So I got to say hello, and he signed my phone for me, and then I lost his signature.
Mine was a bit more. I worked with him a couple of times at the BBC.
Yeah, I mean, you've got.
But my main the first time I met him was very sad for me and really upset me. So I was doing a BBC thing, and we turned up at his place in Mulholland, and he was in a gated community. So we got security. They called up to the house and didn't know we were coming. But they let us through anyway. So we drive up. Once you get through those gated communities, you're on a normal street, Yeah. So we pull up outside one of those typical American houses with a big lawn, children's toys everywhere. I think his youngest adopted children weren't very old then. This is about 2000. And Brian answers the door. I go and ring the doorbell because there's no one there. And he's got a shirt on, but he's in his boxer shorts. And this is before Pet Sounds, the redo of Pet Sounds and Smile. And he was very distant and almost asleep, catatonic, really. We sat him in his music room, and when I was trying to talk to him, he would nod off. And then the thing that really upset me most for was that he said, "What else are you doing on this trip?" And I said, "Oh, I'll tell you, you'll be interested in this. I'm going to see Jeff Barry tomorrow, one of the writers of Be My Baby, And he goes, "That's my favorite song." And I went, "I know." Yeah. He goes, "I love that song." And I went, "Yeah." He goes, "Do you know it?" And I went, Yeah, I know Be My Baby." And then he's like, Be my. And I went, Yeah, I know, Brian. Yeah. And he sang the whole song, the whole thing. But just mumbling, trying to explain to me, "Do you know the song?" Didn't matter how many times I said. Then he went to sleep. So we had to wake him up specifically about half an hour later, once the crew had set up all the equipment, and then we did the interview. It was a very painful interview to do, and I'll tell you, we sat with him downstairs. He had this beautiful house with a nice kind of rococo kind of staircase. But I sat with him in his music room and downstairs in the hall. There's a picture of the two of us sitting together, and I look, hey, I'm sitting with Brian Wilson. And he looks, like, do I have to, Yeah. And when I got outside, I sat side by side with him at the piano, and we bust a bit of Good Vibrations. I wanted to ask him a couple of questions about that. So the easiest thing to do was demonstrate first and then film it. And you know, and he was all over the place. And when we got outside to the car, we were putting the gear away. I turned around and my cameraman had, you know, like a tear in his eye.
Yeah.
The makeup guy had a tear in his eye, and tear in her eye, and to be honest, so did I, because it was quite sad. But then you know what happened? Darian and Co. and Melinda got him into doing the Smile Project. And next time I saw him, he was, you know, quite verbal, and he did that.
Yeah.
I think it was a Don Was film. Oh, I can't remember it. I think it was. It was like a movie, and he's
I just wasn't made for these times, I think.
Yeah, and he's driving around, and he was fine. You know? So I was like, thank God, you know. But what had happened was Jean Severs, who's a wonderful woman who became his conservator at the end, had got delayed in traffic, so she would have been there to greet me, but she was stuck. So she turned up just as we were leaving. You know, I think she didn't forgive herself for that, but it was fine. You know. But the other time we said something about him and also a Beatles connection was that I was lucky enough to work on the first of those Golden Jubilee concerts at Buckingham Palace. Famous one with Brian May doing the, you know,
the guitar on the Buckingham Palace.
Two things happened. One was when we were up on the roof of the palace, obviously with the set up there, and then that bit caught fire. Now, to begin with, we all thought that was us. Obviously, you would. But it was actually a paint and decorate thing. But what happened? Security at Buckingham Palace was very tight anyway. And the second that happened, they stopped the sound check. There was a whole day for sound check and a whole day for the performance, and they filed everyone up to the grass outside Hyde Park Corner. And it started to rain. And I was sitting there with McCartney's guy. It's got the Hoffman violin bass in a case. He's not allowed to leave it, you know. And everyone, and there's Phil Collins sitting next to the cause, and Joe Cocker wandering around, and Brian was just sitting on a box, just sitting there, you know, like this. He's like the greatest songwriter in the world, bar Paul, and you know, no one's talking to him. Everyone's a bit nervous. I know the woman who'd been assigned to him from the BBC crew, and she said, I don't know what to do. And I went, he's fine at the moment. If it rains, we better move him, you know. So, you know, you've worked with him for me, and could you help me? And I was going, he's fine where he is for the moment. I think he's very happy, you know, calm place. So that was one thing, and because there was no hospitality once they all thought we might be terrorists. We were all up there. But the other thing that happened was, Paul came out during Brian's sound check and sat there and just watched the whole thing happen. That was lovely. Which he also did with Joe Cocker when Joe Cocker was doing Little Help, My Friend. It might never come up on this podcast again, so while I'm thinking of it, I remember it. For the sound check, Paul came out, sat there rocking backwards and forwards, going, but come the last person to sound check was Paul McCartney, and so but it was very late and nearly everyone had gone, but Brian had hung around all day just to see that. So me and my cameraman Rick were sat down the front, and another guy called John, with the three of us sitting in the front row. We've got the whole of this Buckingham Palace arena of 20,000 people or whatever it was they'd set up empty. And then out comes Brian and sits a few rows back, and Paul's playing with the orchestra, and he gets to Hey Jude. No, none of us thought about this. It's like, isn't this wonderful? Paul McCartney and an orchestra giving you a personal concert, and then it gets to that breakdown in Hey Jude where he always, you know, so on your feet, you know, and it's like, oh no. So the orchestra are cracking up because there's the four of us standing there. Brian's still sitting in his chair, and we're having na 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 na, and then it's like pointing to my mate Rick, just the boys, and it's like, oh god, you can see what's coming next, you know. So just the girls, you know, Paul's waiting himself, everyone's waiting on themselves. Then a thunderstorm opens, absolutely opens. The sky opens, and I turn around, and we've all run for it, all of us, except for Brian. And Brian is still sitting there on the seat with that kind of slick back hair. He's got flat against his head, drenched the skin. He's not moving. No one's come to get him. I don't know what was going on. And again, it was really sad, you know, but he brought so much joy over his life. It's a sad thing that there was that going on as well. But
I heard another story involving the Beatles where at the Grammys, I think it was, and I think it might have been after show party or something. He was just hanging around. He was with someone. I think and it wasn't like an assistant. It was somebody famous, like an actor. And he just grabbed hold of him and went, "You know John Lennon, don't you?" He's like, "Introduce me." and he made him introduce John Lennon. And John was like, "Oh, hi, Brian. Yeah, how you doing? Yeah, great to see you." And he was like, "Oh, I always, always loved you when when you did Sergeant Pepper. That really blew my mind. It really inspired me to do more." And he was like, "Well, they just went through that sort of, almost like the cliches and say, well, yeah, and if you hadn't written Pet Sounds, and we would never have written that." And he was like, "Oh, that's amazing, yeah." And he walked off. And then someone said, "I can't believe you've never met Brian before," to John Lennon. He went, "I've met him hundreds of times." And he was just like, I don't know what's going on. He just, he's in another place right now. It's kind of terrible, isn't it? Yeah.
I did interview at different points. I've interviewed Carol Kay,
Mm.
Al Blaine, Al Jardine, Dom Randy from the Wrecking Crew, Mike Love, Al Jardine. And I'm going to go through those because I think there might be something salvageable. I could do something new.
Yeah, definitely.
Just
Yeah.
a little compilation of clips from those people, which we could do as a supplement to this. So it'd be without Brian Wilson too. But it was interesting to spend time with the others because the others are all compos mentis, are all thing. But Hal told the story that again choked us all up when he told us it, which was it was very similar to what he did to me with being my baby. When he goes, I went in the studio once, right, and Brian was there, big beard and everything. He goes, sitting at the piano playing something, and he says, "Do you like this? Do you like this one?" He goes, "Yeah, Brian, I love that song. We did that song, years ago. It went to #1. It's a great song. Yeah, Help Me Rhonda or something, right?" And Brian goes, "Do you like this song?" And Hal says in this interview, in the little cut that I've got, he says, he kept saying it over and over again. I was almost crying, because in a few years, that's how much he'd been destroyed. And you saw that little clip as well, didn't you? And with Mike being
being very kind of not the usual cantankerous. He seemed very sort of understanding and kind of giving his props and dues and quite loving. I guess it's like they are a family, aren't they? It's like with anybody, you kind of whatever happens, you still love those people. There's a reason why you were together in the first place, and they are family. So
that's what we were saying with James. That it's probably also something to do with the dynamics of bands as well.
Yeah,
which is
when you start suing each other doesn't help either, does it?
You have to be in a band to understand the band.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, definitely. So, what's your favorite Brian Wilson song? Can you sing it down?
It would be Surf's Up, but as a project, it's Smile. Yeah. And the first time Smile, I mean, I already knew I'd had the bootlegs for years. So I already knew a lot of those clips. So when it was just all chained together so brilliantly with those couple of little interludes and things that they added in you, it just worked so well. But unfortunately, we bought tickets. I think it was in January of 2004. I'm going off the next piece of information. So it was very early, or March 2004, something like that. And I bought 3 tickets for me and my sister and my dad. And then at Christmas 2003, my dad died. And for some reason, I couldn't find anyone to come with me. Jeez. So Beck and I, who are both huge Beach Boy fans and Brian fans, sitting there with this empty seat where Dad should have been. I'll tell you now, I remember that. I remember more than once that night for all kinds of reasons. Both of us ended up in each other's arms crying. It was so whatever. So actually, as well as its integral standalone beauty, actually means a lot to me. It just happened to
I mean, kind of a lovely moment to be able to share that as well, though, I suppose.
Well, if people are going to die, you need to get some resonance out of it. That's
exactly. Thinking of your dad at that stage, amazing.
Yeah, he would have loved it. Yeah, he would have definitely loved it.
Yeah, I went to the second performance at the festival. I couldn't get tickets to the first one, but actually with Simi again, my friend. Quite funny because I remember I was really obsessed with that. There's that book, Listen, Vibrate, Smile. Yeah, like sort of kind of almost like a photo. It was literally just a photocopied book all stuck together, and it was said all the kind of talking about all the bootlegs and demos and stuff, and very kind of very train spottery. And I remember poring over that, and I think I probably borrowed a copy off Samiraj, and I got my own copy, and having all the old bootlegs, mess around with them. And I remember I made it. We got so obsessed we were making tapes and saying to each other how we thought Smile would be put together, and then more, as before the concerts they started releasing, a bit more, and I just remember when they started, because they did sort of greatest hit, not really greatest hits, but famous one. And I remember they did Time to Get Alone quite early on, which is one of my favourites probably. And I remember thinking I was on bits then before it even started. And then there's the interlude, and they started the Smile section, and it started with Our Prayer, which is kind of obvious, and then it goes into the sort of a cappella and barbershop bit of Heroes and Villains, and that's what I'd done on my sort of comments together. So it was like, oh my god! But I was pleased that I'd worked out that because there's a bit, it's really obvious that it's kind of in the same key, so it flows in together. But it's like I was pleased for that. It's like this genius has put this whole thing together, and I was just chuffed that I'd sort of noticed that three little snippets of a song would fit together on it and stuff. But even from then, I was like, oh my god, this is incredible.
I've just read Stuart Maconie's new book on the Beatles, the 100 people who made the Beatles.
Oh, brilliant.
It's quite short. It's pen portraits of 100 people who are key to the Beatles story. It's quite interesting. And one of his stories is the fact that his mum thought it was significant in 63 or 64. And so when he was 3, she took him to a Beatles gig.
Wow.
And he says, I think I can remember, or can't I? You know?
Yeah. It kind of like, being repeated to yourself that, it probably becomes, you believe it, and even if you can't remember it. Wow, that's amazing.
It's an interesting book, actually. I suspect you always think you've met the biggest Beatle fan, and someone's writing one of those books where they're sort of semi-narrating.
Yeah.
You go, hang on a minute, though. Maybe I'm not the biggest fan, because Stuart seems to be right up there.
Yeah. That's awesome. There might be a few of his subjects we can rope in for a podcast as well.
Yeah, he did say he did something. What did he say? The story he was telling, which made me laugh, was he said it was a bit like you meeting Brian. So this was the resonance from what you were saying earlier. He says, I've interviewed Paul 3 times. He goes, I don't really remember anything about the interviews. Caitlin Moran said the same thing. I've interviewed Paul 5 or 6 times. I do remember quite a lot about those interviews, I'll be honest. I was probably in shock, so I remembered them. But he said that at one of them, he was trying to be clever and ask a question I wanted asked before. He says, given, if we could go back in time, would you have preferred to have been in Jerry and the Pacemakers? Then you could have had a career in music, but you wouldn't have had to put up with all the tragedy and death and everything. And Paul looked at him and said, you do know I was in the Beatles, right?
Brilliant. Perfect answer.
Although not as bad as Caitlin Moran, who trying to do the same thing, said, so Paul, if you had a really bad car accident, you had to have plastic surgery, would you come back as Paul, or who else would you come back as? And he looked at her like she was like a mad woman.
Yeah.
Let's talk about this. Season 2 is coming finally.
Yes.
We've both had a very disjointed start to the year for various reasons. And these things this one isn't going to take too long to put together because we're zooming it, but the ones where we go and film take a long time to put together. And with the inserts and everything, and there's just been no time. But the channel's continued to pick up new listeners, and so we're quite excited for season 2.
Yeah.
I've got a few requests in at the moment, but I'm not going to jinx myself by saying who with.
Yeah, no, but we've got some really good ones in the bag already, haven't we? And I think it's looking quite exciting for more to come as well. Yeah.
There does seem to be an ever-growing number, but I hope we're somewhere in the top 2,000 list of good Beatle podcasts. That would be my aim.
I think so. Yeah. I think we're building up slowly. I think it's nice.
Well, the most watched one currently is one from Al Jardine, actually.
Yeah.
That interview is going out later. I was going to launch season 2 with the Al Jardine one, but I feel like it'd be inappropriate right now. Because obviously with these we're dealing with, some of these are archive interviews that we've done, never been broadcast before, but it'd just be weird, wouldn't it?
To not it sounds like he doesn't realize.
I have asked, I spoke to his wife the other day. They're going to see if we can sort something out. She's lovely, Marianne, and if we can, we'll do a top and tail of that one. Because when we spoke, Al wasn't really playing much. But when 10 years ago, he's got a band and he's going on tour through North America at the moment. He's going to do the Pet Sounds kind of music. So he may want to talk about that, which is good because it'd be good to keep it going a little longer with some of the originals in. I went to see the Monkees. They did a reunion tour with all 4. And this was again 99, 2000, something like that.
Yeah.
I was in the music industry, so I got some tickets to Wembley Arena. Couldn't believe it. All four monkeys all together. Anyway, there comes a point in the show where all four have a little turn. So Mickey sung some blues thing, going, before I did this, I was like blues singer, and he, bashes something out.
Right.
Mike does listen to the band or something. I don't know, one of those country ones. Dave does some kind of vaudeville thing. And then Peter sits down and plays some Bach.
Really? Amazing.
On the piano, then gets up on a bass and does like some virtuoso bass playing. And it was like, oh, okay, fair enough.
Can actually do this stuff. Amazing.
He was in with the Neil Youngs of the world and everything else as well, wasn't he, at the time? So as well as
yeah. And I loved all that, and Mike Nesbitt stuff as well. I love those country albums he did. And like me and Magdalena, going off on a topic, that sort of last album they did, not all of them, but yeah, that's incredible. And I know that was all written by other people, but that's one of my favorite songs ever, I think.
The greatest underrated band of all time, even though they sold billions, is the Monkees. We should ask Mickey if he'd come and do it.
Yeah, that'd be amazing.
Right, we should say goodbye. So don't forget to check out the main podcast. The archive is still there, up on Spotify, Apple, and everywhere else. And the YouTube channel has lots of little extra pieces. Mark was talking about album art recently. I've been sharing a few of my, because I am a name dropper. I'm not even going to pretend I'm not. It's just what I do for a freaking living. And now we're doing a podcast. I've got to actually do this stuff, and it feels a bit intense doing it. So I thought I'd at least take the mick out of myself if I'm going to do it. I don't take it seriously at all. But there's a funny story about me screwing up playing Blackbird in front of McCartney, for example.
Yeah.
So go to our YouTube channel and check those things out. But otherwise, we'll see you in a very short time for the beginning of season 2. I look forward to seeing you then.
Yeah, great. Goodbye.